You are moving through tall grass. It is roughly 50,000 years ago. You have been in this landscape your entire life. Every slope, every waterhole, every animal trail memorized through decades of daily movement. You know the smell of rain before it arrives. You know the sound of a predator settling into the brush 40 meters away. And then, one morning, you wake up, and you cannot see, not darkness, not blur, gone. The world you have navigated since childhood, the world your survival is built entirely on, has disappeared. In a modern hospital, this is a medical emergency with a treatment pathway. In a hunter-gatherer group of 30 people on an open landscape, this looks like a death sentence. No food you can gather alone, no hunt you can participate in, no predator you can spot in time. Every skill you have built over a lifetime, suddenly, completely useless. The assumption writes itself. A blind ancient human was a burden no small group could afford to carry. In a world of pure survival math, they would have been left behind, abandoned, or worse. The archaeological record says something so different that when researchers first encountered it, they didn't know what to do with it. In 1908, miners digging near the village of La Chapelle in southern France uncovered a skeleton, Neanderthal, male, estimated age at death between 40 and 50 years old. For a Neanderthal, that was genuinely old. But what stopped the researchers who examined it was not the age. It was the condition of the bones. This individual had lost nearly all of his teeth long before death, not from injury, but from advanced gum disease and decay, a process that takes years. His jaw had partially resorbed around the empty sockets. He had severe osteoarthritis throughout his spine and joints, so debilitating that basic movement would have been agonizing. Multiple old fractures showed as healed bone, injuries that would have left him incapacitated for weeks or months at the time they occurred. He could barely walk. He could not chew hard food. He could not have hunted. He could not have kept pace with a moving group across open terrain. And yet, he lived. For years, in this condition, he lived. The healed fractures alone prove that his group had sustained him through extended periods of total physical dependence. Someone had fed him. Someone had stayed with him when he could not move. Someone had decided, repeatedly, over years, that this individual's life was worth the group's resources. Anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, who spent decades studying Neanderthal remains, called this pattern the sustained care of individuals who could not contribute to group survival, one of the most significant and overlooked findings in the entire field of paleoanthropology, because the man at La Chapelle was not an exception. The sites multiply the moment you look for them. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, a Neanderthal skeleton designated Shanidar I was excavated in the 1950s by archaeologist Ralph Selecki. The individual was male, approximately 40 years old at death. He had suffered a crushing blow to the left side of his skull at some point in his life, an injury severe enough to have caused significant vision loss or complete blindness in his left eye. His right arm had been fractured and partially healed, then re-injured, then healed again, eventually withering from disuse. His lower leg showed evidence of repeated injury. He walked with a pronounced limp. He was, by any physical measure, severely disabled across multiple systems simultaneously: vision, mobility, and the use of one arm. He survived to 40 in a Neanderthal population. Selecki's conclusion was careful and precise. This individual could not have survived without sustained, deliberate care from the members of his group. Not occasional help, sustained, ongoing, intentional support across years of functional limitation. 40 years old, partially blind, one working arm, a body full of healed injuries that should have been fatal. Someone kept him alive, not once, every day, for years. The evidence doesn't stop with Neanderthals. It runs forward through time and across species into early Homo sapiens populations, and it carries the same signature everywhere it appears. At a site in Vietnam called Man Bac, dating to roughly 4,000 years ago, archaeologists found the skeleton of a young man who had died in his early 20s. His bones told a story that took researchers years to fully understand. From early adolescence, perhaps from birth, he had been completely paralyzed from the waist down. His lower vertebrae had fused. His leg bones had atrophied from total disuse. He had not walked, possibly ever. He could not have fed himself. He could not have moved himself from place to place. He could not have managed basic bodily functions without assistance. Every calorie he consumed, every time he moved locations with the group, every day of his life past the point his paralysis became total. All of it required another human being to deliberately choose to provide it. He lived to his early 20s, in a pre-agricultural community where physical capability was the primary currency of survival. Bioarchaeologist Lorna Tilley, who led the analysis of the man-back skeleton, argued that the evidence demanded a conclusion that archaeologists had been slow to accept. Long-term, resource-intensive care of individuals with severe disabilities was not a rare anomaly in ancient human populations. It was a pattern, a consistent, recurring, cross-cultural pattern that appears wherever the skeletal evidence is preserved well enough to read it. Now here's the part that nobody talks about, and it reframes everything. The assumption underlying the burden model, the idea that a blind or disabled ancient human would be abandoned because they consumed resources without contributing, contains a fundamental error about how ancient human groups actually worked. It assumes that contribution was purely physical. It wasn't. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer communities have documented consistently that the most valued members of a group are rarely the strongest hunters or the fastest gatherers. They are the oldest members, the ones who can no longer run, but who carry something no one else in the group possesses: memory, accumulated knowledge, decades of pattern recognition about a specific landscape, specific animals, specific plants, specific weather, knowledge that cannot be transmitted in a season and cannot be reconstructed from scratch. Knowledge that only exists in one place, inside the mind of the person who lived it. An elder Jew/Huanxi woman who can no longer walk to the gathering grounds still knows which plants survive a drought and which ones poison you under stress. She knows because she lived through the last drought, 40 years ago, when no one else in the group was old enough to remember it. A blind ancient human who had spent 40 years learning a landscape before losing their sight did not lose that knowledge when the vision went. The mental map remained. The accumulated understanding of animal behavior remained. The social knowledge, who could be trusted, how conflicts had been resolved, what decisions had led to disaster in the past, all of it remained. In a world with no writing, no external storage of any kind, that knowledge was irreplaceable. It existed in exactly one location, and the group that lost it carelessly paid a price that took a generation to recover from. Keeping a blind elder alive was not charity. It was an investment in the only library the group had. But there is something deeper here than resource calculation, and the skeletal evidence forces you to confront it. The care documented at La Chapelle au Sein, at Shanidar Cave, at Man-Back, this was not minimal. It was not the bare threshold of keeping a body alive. At Shanidar, the pollen evidence suggests flowers were brought to the burial. At La Chapelle au Sein, the body was placed in a deliberately prepared grave, positioned with care. At Man-Back, the physical demands of keeping a paralyzed young man alive across years of a mobile, semi-nomadic existence were enormous, and someone met them every day for years. This is not the behavior of a group performing a cold survival calculation. This is the behavior of a group that had decided, at some level that preceded calculation, that the people inside it had value that was not reducible to what they could produce. Paleoanthropologist Penny Spickens at the University of York has spent years arguing that this capacity, the willingness to sustain individuals through extended vulnerability at significant cost, is not incidental to human evolution. It is central to it. The social bonds that made it possible were the same bonds that made large-scale cooperation possible. The emotional architecture that moved a group to feed a blind elder was the same architecture that moved them to share a kill with a family who had nothing, to defend someone else's children, to build the webs of reciprocal obligation that allowed human groups to grow beyond the size any other primate had achieved. Compassion was not a luxury evolution, permitted when the math worked out. It was one of the engines of the math. There is one more thing the blind ancient human tells us, and it is the most personal part of this entire story. The experience of losing your sight, suddenly, completely is one that modern neuroscience has studied in depth. What happens in the brain of a person who goes blind in adulthood is not a simple subtraction. The visual cortex, deprived of its normal input, does not go quiet. It reorganizes. It begins accepting input from other senses, sound, touch, spatial memory, and processing it with the same intensity it previously devoted to vision. Blind individuals develop enhanced sensitivity to sound localization. They develop finer tactile discrimination. They develop a capacity for detailed spatial memory, navigating environments through touch and sound and internal map that sighted individuals rarely achieve because they never have to. The ancient human who went blind at 40, in a group that chose to sustain them, did not spend the remaining years of their life as a passive recipient of care. They spent those years developing a relationship with the world through senses they had never needed to rely on before, learning a landscape they thought they knew through new instruments, contributing differently, but contributing. The blind tracker who could no longer see a trail could still hear the tension in the grass when something moved through it, could still read the wind for information the eyes never accessed, could still tell from the particular quality of a night's silence that something was wrong, different, not gone. Think about the person you would be if you lost your sight tomorrow. Everything you know about your own home, your neighborhood, the faces you can reconstruct from memory with your eyes closed, the sounds you already use to navigate, the ones your brain processes automatically without telling you, the accumulated knowledge of 40 years of living in a specific world that exists entirely inside your mind, independent of your eyes. You would not be starting over. You would be continuing differently. Your ancient ancestor, lying in that grass on the morning their vision disappeared, was not at the end of their story, in a group that chose to keep them alive, and the evidence says, again and again, that groups made that choice. They were at the beginning of a different chapter of it. The archaeological record of ancient disability is not a record of burden and abandonment. It is a record of groups who understood, long before anyone had words for it, that the value of a person could not be read off their physical capacity on any given morning. They understood it not because they were noble, because they were human, and so were you.